So today I'm actually going to take you on a bit of a journey, and I'm going to start back in March 2018, which was a very significant day in my life, and it changed the trajectory of both my professional and my personal life. And back then it was because I was dissecting a human brain. But I think, as Niall has already said, my name's Michael and I work as a neuropathologist. I'm based at RPA Hospital in Sydney. And what that means is that actually my whole job is diagnosing and classifying human neurological disease through examination of human tissue. And I examine the tissue both with the naked eye and under the microscope. And so, in fact, that day, back in March 2018, it was probably the 1,000th brain I'd actually dissected. But what was unique about that brain, it was the first time in my career that I was able to examine the brain from a professional rugby league player. And it was something that I'd been working towards for quite some time, but as it turned out, it was on that day that I first got to hold one in my hands. And I was looking actually for a disease that no one in modern Australia had ever looked for before. And that disease is called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. And today I really want to talk to you about CTE, about what it is, about the problems we have with not only with understanding it, but accepting it in a country like Australia that loves its footy, and perhaps most importantly, what we can do to help our children and our children's children avoid ever having to face this terrible brain disease. So, what is CTE? CTE is a degenerative brain disease. In some ways it's quite similar to Alzheimer's disease, but in other ways it's quite different. So it does strike people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, but equally it can strike people in their late teenage years, in their 20s or in their 30s. And actually, unlike Alzheimer's disease, we know what causes CTE, and that is exposure to repeated head impacts, particularly when you're young. Often CTE symptoms actually start out very subtly, and typically they start years, if not decades, after you've finished playing contact sports. And if the disease declares itself in young people, often they have symptoms that we would think of as mental health problems. So it will often start with depression or anxiety, impulsivity, aggression, drug and alcohol abuse, thoughts or actions of suicide. If the disease declares itself in older people, then it typically looks like a bit like Alzheimer's disease. They have problems with their memory, problems with thinking and planning. So we've actually known about CTE for almost 100 years, but for the vast majority of that time, we've thought of it as a very rare disease, and a disease almost restricted just to some people that did a lot of boxing. And in fact, in the 1950s, Marlon Brando actually won an Oscar for portraying a boxer suffering from this disease. And that disease back then was often called punch drunk or dementia pugilistica. And certainly, even when I was training as a pathologist, I had in my mind that this was a disease that was pretty much just a historical oddity. It was described in the past, but only in a few people that had done a lot of boxing. And it was really only in 2005, Bennett Omalu published the first case of CTE in an ex-professional American football player. And subsequent to that, people like me all over the world started to wonder if maybe this wasn't just a historical oddity, and maybe this disease was something that we'd see in other people that were exposed to large numbers of head impacts. People like contact sports players, Australian rules footballers, rugby league players, rugby union players, even soccer players. And then in 2013, Dr. Anne McKee from Boston University published the first large case series of CTE in American football players. And using modern laboratory techniques, she beautifully illustrated the pathology of the disease in such a way that someone, a neuropathologist like me, on the other side of the world, could understand what I had to look for and where I had to look for it in the brain to be able to diagnose the disease. So I guess I started off this journey back in March 2018 out of a very simple and very naive intellectual curiosity. I'd been reading what had been coming out of the US from Dr. McKee's lab, as well as the material coming out of the UK from Dr. Willie Stewart, thinking, wow, that's really interesting. You know, I see lots of brains and I diagnose lots of brain disease. I diagnose Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, motor neuron disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I see all these degenerative brain diseases, but I've actually never seen that disease before. And it took me a little while, but then I realised actually maybe I'm not looking in the right population, and maybe if I actually looked in the population that would be at risk, and maybe if I looked in the right parts of the brain, then maybe I'd start to see this disease. So my life really changed back in 2018 when, for the first time in that very first brain from a professional rugby player, I looked at it and it was riddled with CTE. Very soon after that, I launched the Australian Sports Brain Bank. I launched it with the help of Dr. Chris Nowinski from the Concussion Legacy Foundation. And the Australian Sports Brain Bank is actually the sister brain bank, or a sister brain bank, of Dr. McKee's brain bank in Boston. So now we're in 2023. I've actually seen the disease many, many more times since then. Last year we published the results of the first 21 brains we'd examined that had been donated to the Australian Sports Brain Bank. 12 of those 21 had CTE. In fact, it was the most common pathology we found in that group. We found it in ex-professionals, but we also found it in people that had only ever played at the amateur level. We found it in some people in their 60s and 70s and even 80s. We also found it in people in their 20s and early 30s. And to date, we've actually been very busy. We've now finished examining 60 brains donated to the Sports Brain Bank. And of those 60, we're still looking at 50% of them with CTE. And perhaps the most disturbing association is that of those with CTE, half of them died from suicide. Now, at the same time, because suddenly I realised maybe I'd been missing something, I started to screen every brain that came through our lab for this disease. And over about 250 brains, we have found it a few times. And it's sitting at around 2% diagnosis rate in this sort of routine cohort of brains. That's compared to the 50% rate in contact sports players. And of those few that we've found in our routine service, they've all had a history of repeated brain trauma. So I know people often talk about concussion with CTE, and I hope you've noticed that I actually haven't used the word concussion up until now. That's because CTE is not an issue of concussion. And often when we announce some famous footballer has been diagnosed with CTE posthumously, the sporting codes will come out and say, well, we have the best concussion policies in the world. But there's actually zero evidence that good management of a concussion has any impact on your risk of getting CTE. And what does seem to correlate with your risk of getting CTE is your years of contact sports played. And also, on a related note, the age of first exposure to contact sports participation. And it's likely that years of sports played is a proxy for exposure to these repeated head impacts. And it's not just the concussions, but lots and lots of blows to the head that is part of the rough and tumble of the game that leave you with no signs or symptoms, but are actually doing very subtle damage to your brain. And the brain is obviously quite a unique organ. It's what makes us us. But there's something else that's unique about it, is that it actually can't feel pain. So if you twist your ankle, like, you know about it straight away because it hurts. And that pain gives you feedback to modify your behaviour to try and avoid further pain. But the brain, that doesn't happen. And you might have seen on television or heard about neurosurgeons operating on people while they're awake, or they're talking or playing the violin. And they're able to do that because the brain doesn't feel any pain. So it's likely that for every concussion that someone gets on the footy field, there's probably many dozens, if not hundreds, of similar-sized impacts, all causing very, very subtle damage that they have no idea they're experiencing. And there is actually quite good evidence for this. So in American football, in college, they have taken brain scans at the beginning of a season and at the end of the season, and they're able to see subtle structural changes on those scans of brain damage, even though none of those players ever had a concussion. And similarly, if they go looking in the blood, they can find markers, very subtle markers of traumatic brain injury at the end of the season, even though none of those players ever experienced a concussion. Also, psychological testing pre and post season. After a season of contact sports, American college football players will actually perform worse on standard psychological tests. Again, they've had no concussions. So CTE is not an issue of concussion. It's exposure to repeated head impacts. So I did say this has taken over my life somewhat. And I guess I was very naive when I started. I was just curious to see what I could find. I thought I found a problem, and I thought everyone would say, "Oh, gee, thank you very much for pointing out this problem. We're just going to go and change things now, and we'll make sure that, it never happens again." But in fact, I got all this pushback from all these different sort of completely unexpected parts of society. And I guess it became very evident very quickly that, this is not just a medical problem. This is a sociological problem. It's a problem of health versus big business. And that's why there seems to be a lot of noise about this and a lot of controversy. That's certainly my opinion. So I think, as far as I can remember, footy has been an integral part of a way of life in Australia. I think if you look at the most watched TV programs over the last 20 years, the vast majority of them are football grand finals. And sporting organisations in Australia have taken on an enormous power. It's not just, say, multi-billion-dollar broadcast rights that are announced, or multi-million-dollar salary packages for football players or football executives. It's also gambling revenue, which is now bringing in millions of dollars of revenue. So there's certainly a big business side of things, which often can be resistant to change if that's going to maybe impact on their product and their revenue stream. But it's actually even more than that, I think, because I think, footy is very important to many people. Often it may define large parts of their life. It might be how they socialise. It might be how their family bonds together. It might be how they define value in themselves or in others. And I think sort of the Australian, values of mateship and courage, a lot of that is often defined, at least partially, through sport. So it's almost like sport has a not dissimilar space in our minds to, say, the Catholic Church or other religion, where it can be very important to people and be fundamental to how they see themselves and see the world. So they're trying to give a message that, in fact, maybe footy is actually damaging our children, has led to, as I said, quite a bit of pushback. So when I actually diagnosed that first case in 2018, there were, I think, over 1.5 million registered players of Australian rules football, and there were hundreds of thousands of registered players for rugby league and rugby union, and there would be many more playing soccer as well. And in a population of 25 million, which is roughly our population now, that's actually a significant proportion of the population. And it's even more significant when you think that it's all the youth, or mostly the youth, that are playing these games. So it is potentially quite a significant public health issue. And even more recently, I guess, even in the last 10 years, we've seen this, it's not just a boys' game. There's this huge surge of female participation in football, and there's now professional female codes for the big sporting codes. So it's certainly a problem that a wide spectrum of our young population is potentially exposed to. So I guess this is why I'm here talking to you today. And for me, this is actually a first. It's another first, and I think another very important first. Because for the first time, I'm not actually speaking to journalists or other doctors or scientists or sports administrators. I get to speak to you directly, and I get to speak to you as mothers and fathers and grandparents and aunts and uncles. Because I want to give you this message so that you understand and so that you can take action to help your loved ones and to protect your loved ones. Because I tell you that if you wait till the big sporting organisations catch up with the science and admit that there's a problem with their product, it will be too late every single child playing sport today. So it's actually up to all of you to take action for your families. So if you're my vintage, you probably remember getting on the bus to go to the shops, and it was full of cigarette smoke. And it was extremely unpleasant, but you had no choice. That's just the way it was back then. But it's not the way it is now. And I think our children would be horrified if you made them get on a bus filled with smoke these days, because we understand that's not good. And it's not good for children. And similarly, I guess if you grew up in Australia like me and you're my vintage or older, you'd actually probably remember every summer on a Monday morning you'd go to school and you'd slap your mates on the back to say g'day. And the reason you slapped them on the back is because you knew there was a very good chance that they had terrible sunburn all over their back and all over their shoulders. And it certainly wasn't uncommon then for over that week for all that top layer of skin to peel off your back. And that was fine. That was part of summer fun back then. But it's not fine now, because now we understand that actually does harm. Too much sun exposure, particularly in children, leads to later in life increased risk of skin cancer. And that's the mindset we need to bring to contact sports. It's an issue of managing exposure, and particularly managing exposure to head impacts in children. So as I've said, the way we deal with CTE, the way we prevent it, is reducing a cumulative lifetime exposure to repeated head impacts and trying to delay the age of onset of first exposure to these repeated head impacts. So how can we do this? Well, there's actually lots of different ways. So the most obvious way is enrol your kids in touch or flag footy, at least until they're in high school. Don't let them head the ball and do lots of heading drills in soccer. Or if they're completely footy mad, teenager that's not going to change their ways, don't let them play rugby league one day and the next day play rugby union. There's lots of different ways and lots of practical ways we can work to reduce that exposure and that cumulative exposure. And the best one is going to be the one that works for you and your family. So I guess I want to leave you with a very simple message, and it's certainly a message that you don't need a neuropathologist to tell you, but that message really is that it's actually not a good idea to let your children be hit in the head a lot. Thank you.